nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chad Lecciadello.
This week, is the era of small government over? And the appalling medical trial that explains why some Americans don't trust doctors.
As US states rush to legalise marijuana, we're going to talk to a former White House advisor who just says no. And we'll bust some malarkey about Biden's burger ban. But first...
President Biden delivered his first address to a joint session of Congress this week. Being the first year of his presidency, the speech was not billed as a State of the Union and, due to COVID restrictions, it was socially distant, with only about one-fifth the usual number of representatives, senators, judges, administration and military officials on hand. For Joe Biden, who has watched presidents from Richard Nixon to Barack Obama deliver just such an address, first as a senator, then as VP, the moment was a long time coming, and he acknowledged another piece of history was being made.
Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, no president has ever said those words from this podium. No president has ever said those words. And it's about time.
As you'd expect, there were moments of rhetorical flourishes and a symbolic declaration that the Reagan era of small government, low taxation was over. It's time to tax the rich, who are only growing richer as a result of the pandemic.
My fellow Americans, trickle down. Trickle down economics has never worked. And it's time to grow the economy from the bottom and the middle out.
Yeah, Biden tried to create a new narrative there, even bouncing off the left to do it.
Sometimes I have arguments with my friends in the Democratic Party. I think you should be able to become a billionaire and a millionaire, but pay your fair share.
And his attempted redefinitions didn't end there. He tried to redefine the climate issue as well.
For too long, we've failed to use the most important word when it comes to meeting the climate crisis: jobs. 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 Think about it. There is simply no reason why the blades for wind turbines can't be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing. No reason. None. No reason.
He used the word jobs 40 times during that speech, John, and I don't think it was an accident.
Well, I hope it wasn't an accident. It's a big accident. Biden wasn't going for too many rousing applause lines, though. His tone was more of a cosy chat than a barn-burning speech. He did tick off a laundry list of his achievements so far: the Relief Act, the vaccination rollout and his infrastructure plan. Despite going it alone legislatively so far, he is still giving lip service, at least, to bipartisanship.
I'd like to meet with those who have ideas that are different, they think are better. I welcome those ideas. But the rest of the world is not waiting for us. I just want to be clear. From my perspective, doing nothing is not an option.
He really did go out of his way to be nice to the right there, even thanking Mitch McConnell personally for honouring Bo's memory. And look how generous he was to Republicans here.
We kept our commitment, Democrats and Republicans, of sending $1,400 rescue checks to 85% of American households. We've already sent more than 160 million checks out the door. It's making a difference.
Now, literally 0 Republicans actually voted for those $1,400 checks that he just gave them credit for. He was prepared to do anything for Republicans, except offer any actual policy concessions. Like you say, John, lip service.
Yeah.
But he's good at it.
Yeah, so far. President Biden framed congressional inaction, meanwhile, as a threat to America's future place in the world. And the action he wants after his infrastructure bill is a new $1.8 trillion American Families Plan, including universal pre-K education for 3 and 4-year-olds, plus 2 years free community college tuition, caps on childcare costs, extending Obamacare subsidies, paid family leave, and $800 billion in tax cuts for low and middle income earners. That takes Biden's spending plans for his first 100 days to an even $6 trillion, although so far only the COVID rescue plan has actually passed Congress. We'll see what else gets through the Senate. Biden does plan to pay for it all, though, by returning the top marginal tax rate to where it was 20 years ago and closing corporate tax loopholes and beefing up enforcement by the IRS. But regular Americans, he says, will not pay more.
I'm not looking to punish anybody, but I will not add a tax burden, additional tax burden to the middle class in this country. They're already paying enough.
I know that employ more tax agents gain $700 billion. There's a certain magic beans quality about it, but the IRS has really been run down for about a decade now. So if anything, $700 billion is a conservative estimate of what could be yielded from reform. I've seen some people estimate that there are trillions of dollars being skimmed through tax evasion.
Yes, although the evaders will find a way to evade eventually. But look, if Joe Biden's speech seemed a tad on the long side, it was 5 minutes longer than Trump's first speech to Congress, about 15 minutes longer than either Obama or George W. Bush's first speech to Congress, equal to Bill Clinton, who was known for being on the loquacious side.
Yeah, and over an hour long. The part of the speech that most resonated with me personally was this bit at the end.
Thank you for your patience.
Yes!
Any standing ovation he got all night.
But you know, the most important bit of a speech is not the end bit. It's usually what they cram in at the top before people zone out. And in this case, still COVID.
Everyone over the age of 16, everyone is now eligible to get vaccinated right now, right away. Go get vaccinated, America. Go and get the vaccination. They're available.
He looks straight down the barrel with that one. Biden can have all the policy proposals he likes, but for me personally, getting people to take that vaccine would still be more likely to affect his fortunes in 2022 than any other thing. But we'll be coming back to that one later on, John.
Yes, indeed we will. But for more now, we're joined by Elaine Kmark. She is a former top policy advisor to Bill Clinton and Al Gore. She's a member of the Democratic National Committee, now based at the Brookings Institution. Elaine, welcome back to Planet America.
Great to be with you.
I wonder, we're now marking 100 days of Joe Biden's presidency. Some are suggesting that he's, for an old moderate, he's turned out to be an extremely progressive president, at least early on. How do you see things?
Well, I think he is an extremely progressive president, and I think that the entire Democratic Party has moved back to an era of big government, if you will. Mostly because of changes that have happened in the country that I think, 2 decades ago when Bill Clinton was president, we really couldn't anticipate. And the biggest one, of course, is the huge inequality in wealth, which has been exacerbated, of course, by the pandemic. So I think most of the Democratic Party is now in line with where Joe Biden is.
So what happens, Elaine, if Joe Manchin holds firm and Joe Biden doesn't get much more out of his first-term agenda? Do the Democrats move further left in frustration, or do they move back towards Joe Manchin?
Well, I think Joe Manchin will not stand in the way of Biden getting most of what he wants. I think what will happen is that Joe Manchin will weigh in on a couple of different pieces, and he will shape the legislation. But he's not going to be, he's a good Democrat. He's not going to single-handedly thwart the new president of the United States. All he said about the new upcoming legislation is that the price tag makes him uncomfortable. That's probably the case with a couple other senators. But, let's face it, Joe Biden comes out of the Senate. He knows how to negotiate, and he knows that what he has put on the table is a starting point, a big and substantial and well thought out starting point, and it will change. But I don't think there is a Democrat that can throw Biden off the path he's chosen.
Elaine, yesterday's address to Congress was quite low-key at times, possibly in keeping with the kind of the socially distanced sort of smaller gathering and so on, but there seemed to be a lot in it, including that kind of declaration that trickle-down never worked, sort of the end of Reaganism almost.
Right.
What else stood out to you as particularly significant?
Well, I think the big thing, and particularly for the rest of the world, is there was two lines in there about how American taxpayer tax dollars are going to pay for American products that create American jobs. I think you're going to see an emphasis on buy American and produce American that we have not seen forever. Trump, interestingly enough, picked up on this early on in his administration. One of the first things he did was he took on the Carrier air conditioning company for moving to Mexico. And I thought, uh-oh, this guy's onto something. But then in typical Trump fashion, he never paid any attention to it. After that, he never kept it up. And Biden, I think, is really onto something, and it may be the most significant thing out of that speech.
You mentioned the American-made aspect and that Trump had tried that briefly in an earlier period. Something that Trump was much more consistent about was anti-China rhetoric. And I couldn't help notice there was a lot of China talk from Joe Biden during that speech yesterday. I'm wondering, has the ground changed permanently when it comes to America and China? Are we in a new world?
We are in a new world because of all the things that, Joe Biden and Donald Trump do not agree about. There's a lot of agreement on China policy. Now, Biden will try to deal with China on climate change, but he's going to be much tougher on human rights. And he's going to be very tough on intellectual property and all of the issues that the United States has had for some decades now with China. So, the way I look at it is Trump and Biden on Russia are 180 degrees different. Trump and Biden on China, pretty much the same. And that's because the ground has shifted in the United States vis-a-vis China.
Elaine, it seems that the incoming Biden administration strategy was almost blitzkrieg-like in its swiftness. Before they can get their defences together, before the Republicans can even figure out what to do about Donald Trump and the contested election and the Capitol Hill riot, and we're just going to get a bunch of stuff done. Can they keep going? Can that momentum continue, or to extend that analogy, do the supply lines run out at some point?
I think they've got the wind at their backs right now. And what gave them the wind at their backs was the prompt and effective action on the pandemic. That effort, which Biden put together during his transition, has worked so well that he's got a lot of goodwill in the public, including from some Trump supporters who are happy to see this turning around. And I think that's going to carry him for at least the rest of the year and help him negotiate with the Congress on some of the things he laid out tonight or last night. After the end of the year, I don't dare prognosticate, but we've got a great stock market. We have 1.6% growth. We're going to have over 6% growth this year. No, we haven't seen that in a long, long time. And that's kind of what you want when you're president.
Elaine Kmark, always a great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, to one of those stories that probably is an even bigger deal than it might sound. Every 10 years, the United States conducts its national census, and the data it gathers helps to determine where people live and what they need, and it guides all sorts of policy and political decisions, including things like where to build a new school or a new hospital. 2020 was just such a census year, and this week the top-line results were released showing the US resident population was almost 331.5 million. Up almost 23 million in the past decade. But that is a growth rate of just 7.4%, the second lowest increase in America's history. The most populous state, still California, 39.5 million people. The least populous, Wyoming, just under 577,000, all up. The largest population growth was in the Lone Star state of Texas, which was up almost 4 million in the decade. And all of that matters because there are a fixed number of members in the US House of Representatives, 435. And these census numbers are used to determine where those representatives will come from. It also determines how many electoral college votes each state gets for the next two presidential elections. And so here are the winners and losers. Texas gains 2 House seats for a new total of 38, while an extra representative goes to Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Oregon and Montana. That comes at the expense, though, of Michigan down 1, so too Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, West Virginia. California lost a seat for the first time since it became a state in 1850, and New York, which lost a House seat by falling just 89 residents short of Minnesota's total, which had been in danger of losing a representative. Winning or losing House seats leads to a redrawing of congressional district maps, and as we know, they can be the subject of partisan gerrymandering. We also don't know at this stage how it's going to feed into the balance of power in the House. More on that in a moment, but we do know it would have made a small difference in the Electoral College. If last November's presidential election had been held with the new apportionment, Joe Biden would have still won, but by 3 fewer Electoral College votes, 303 to 235 chairs.
Interestingly though, if you go back a few more years to the 2000 presidential election and overlay these new apportionments to their original votes, Bush's narrow 271 to 267 win becomes a comfortable 290 to 248 win.
Take that, Al Gore!
And if you look at the overall changes since 1960, Florida, Texas and California have all gained about 15 seats each at the expense of New York, Pennsylvania and Ohio, amongst other states. In actual fact, for all the excitement that this census result has produced, it's been the smallest post-census reapportionment in history. How small? Well, analyst Dave Wasserman estimates that Republicans may net 3 or 4 seats out of redistricting. Sean Trendy also estimates a gain of 4, and Republicans need 5 seats to take the House in 2022. So it's something, but not massive. Really, the key is going to be how the actual districts are drawn, because there's all kinds of potential mischief there. So, who is drawing the lines? For 43% of House seats, it's Republicans. For 17% of House seats, it's Democrats. And for 38% of House seats, it's either a split legislature or an independent commission. In other words, Republicans are going to always have the advantage there until either the system's changed or Democrats win more state legislatures. But I'd like to go back to what you said, sir, about population growth before. Yeah. You know that this was the second slowest population growth rate in history. Now, that's not just a COVID thing. Population growth has been trending downwards every decade since the 1950s. This is a long-term trend, and it really could have some dire consequences when there aren't enough workers around to support all the pensioners, which is interesting given the current context of the immigration debate that we are supposedly having. By all means, sort out the process by which people come on over. But right now, people wanting to come to America to work might be a resource that America might not want to squander.
Or it may become a personal care robot debate rather than an immigration debate. There is good news to report, though, on the COVID front this week. The US Centers for Disease Control have relaxed official guidelines for people who have been vaccinated. In most cases, they can now go outdoors without a mask, and in some circumstances, indoors without a mask as well. In New York Central Park this week, while not everybody was tearing off their mask, they were certainly welcoming the news.
It's really exciting to finally be able to hear people and see people.
This is exciting and a step in the right direction.
I get to go back to school and communicate with my friends.
People must be freed, must be given the chance to breathe free air.
Even with the pandemic, people are very respectful of other people.
I think it's exciting. It says to me that we're making some progress.
And appearing without his mask, President Biden took the opportunity to encourage more Americans to get vaccinated.
If you're vaccinated, you can do more things more safely, both outdoors as well as indoors. So for those who haven't gotten their vaccination yet, especially if you're younger or think you don't need it, this is another great reason to go get vaccinated. Now.
US regulators also lifted a pause on the use of the single-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine this week, concluding the benefits of the shots outweigh the risks posed by a very rare blood clotting disorder linked to it. There are no restrictions on its use now, but the panel did propose a warning label be added for women under the age of 50. Meanwhile, there are growing concerns that too many Americans are getting just one shot, but not the second shot required to gain the full effect of some vaccines. The New York Times reporting this week, 5 million people, or nearly 8% of those who got a first shot of either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, have missed their second dose. Some feared side effects. Others felt erroneously that they were sufficiently protected by just the one shot. And in some cases, providers like pharmacy Walgreens sent some people who got a first shot of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine to get their second doses at pharmacies that only had the other vaccine on hand. So that was a bit of a snafu.
Dull. But we are seeing these kinds of problems everywhere, though. With over 1 billion vaccine doses being administered worldwide so far, yet only 3% of the world are fully vaccinated. India in particular is facing real issues right now. Almost 400,000 new cases a day, or about 43% of the new cases in the whole world. And those are just the official cases. Some researchers estimate that India's real case numbers could be 20 times higher. We just don't know. That's why Biden has opted to share America's stockpile of AstraZeneca vaccines, with as many as 60 million doses expected to be available once they clear safety review. But that review is not a formality, because the AstraZeneca vaccines were manufactured at the plant where production was halted because of contamination fears. And that was just 10 million doses anyway. They might be approved in a few weeks, but the other 50 million doses won't be ready until May or June. So at least in that respect, India seems to be largely on their own for now. But how's America going? Not too bad. If we look at all the red zones from a few weeks ago, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York and Rhode Island, the new case numbers are all coming down. As John said, the J&J vaccine pause is over, and their final figures showed only 15 clots in total. Yes, they're all amongst women, especially younger women, but that leaves young women with a 0.0007% chance of clotting. Not much. And an even lower chance for everyone else. But here's the problem. Whether it's a supply issue because of the vaccine pause or whether it's vaccine hesitancy kicking in, there are only 1.6 million doses administered earlier this week, the lowest number since April 6, and the average rate of vaccinations is falling further. That's the black line you see there on that graph. For their part, Kaiser have projected that the supply of vaccines will exceed demand in 3 to 4 weeks, and that report was put out a week ago, so make that 2 to 3 weeks. America's leaders aren't exactly radiating confidence in their vaccinations either. Biden has been wearing masks during teleconferences for some reason, and Kamala Harris appears to be trying to break the Guinness World Record for social distancing during her interviews. Having said that, the essential issue has not changed. 74% of Democrats have now been vaccinated, but only 40% of Republicans have. And only 8% of Democrats are unwilling to be vaccinated, but 34% of Republicans are unwilling. There is your problem right there. And it's fair to say that Republican thought leaders aren't generally being very helpful.
Your response when you see children wearing masks as they play should be no different from your response to seeing someone beat a kid in Walmart. Call the police immediately. Contact Child Protective Services. Keep calling until someone arrives. What you're looking at is abuse. It's child abuse, and you are morally obligated to attempt to prevent it.
Dave, hit it. It's in our contract to play that every week, John. So what to do? The governor of West Virginia's got an idea. Simply pay $100 in savings bonds to everyone between 16 and 35 who gets vaccinated. Hey, it's worth a try.
Can't hoit. Now, African Americans have been particularly hard hit by this COVID-19 pandemic. While they're only slightly more likely than white Americans to catch it, they're almost 3 times as likely to be hospitalised and twice as likely to die. And as a result, black people are, by and large, more likely to wear masks and take a range of other precautions. Yet, only 61% say they will definitely or probably get vaccinated, compared with almost 70% of white people and 90% of Asian Americans. Overall, African Americans show lower levels of trust in vaccines. More than 90% say that they are concerned about side effects, while almost 3/4 of those who say they won't get a COVID shot say they've seen too many mistakes from the medical care system in the past, and nearly 60% say they just don't usually get vaccines. And for many black men in particular, those concerns, that lack of trust, can be summed up in just one word: Tuskegee. May 16th, 1997, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, US President Bill Clinton is apologising.
I am sorry.
Among the group of 7 men he's apologising to, 95-year-old Herman Shaw.
I'm saddened today to think of those who did not survive and whose families will forever live with the knowledge that their death and suffering was preventable.
In 1932, in the darkest days of the Great Depression, Herman Shaw was a 30-year-old farmer growing cotton, corn and turnip greens on the family's acreage near Tallahassee, Alabama. He was married with 2 small children and struggling to put food on the table. Herman couldn't believe his luck when he was given a flyer advertising free medical care.
Free blood test, free treatment by county health department and government doctors. You may feel well and still have bad blood. Come and bring all your family.
Herman Shaw was one of 600 African American men who signed up at the local church. Every month they got blood tests and were given aspirin and tonics for their bad blood. Once a year, they received a full medical examination. Many endured excruciating spinal taps, and then they were sent away with a free meal. What they didn't know was they were a part of a medical experiment being conducted by the US Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control, based at the Tuskegee Institute just down the highway. Of the 600 black men given free treatment, almost 2/3 had syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease which begins as a few sores or a rash and years later can cause damage to the heart and other organs, and in some cases lead to dementia, blindness and death. In the early 1930s, the disease was rampant in impoverished areas like rural Alabama, with about 35% of adults infected. None of those 399 men were told they had syphilis. None of them were treated with effective panaceas. None of their families were ever warned, and none consented to take part in what is now known as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. As far as scientists were concerned, it was a great success.
It promises to be the most illuminating investigation of its type yet undertaken, an outstanding contribution to the literature.
By then, it had been discovered that the antibiotic penicillin cured syphilis, but the experiment continued. The men still didn't know they were sick, and they were not given penicillin. By then, more than 1/3 of the infected men had died. Others were put in asylums because of their dementia. In 1957, the surviving men were given a certificate and $25, $1 for each year of their so-called treatment. It wasn't until July 1972 that the truth was revealed by Associated Press reporter Jean Heller. It made the front page of the New York Times but was overshadowed by news about the Vietnam War and the presidential election. It was only then the Tuskegee men were told if they had syphilis. In his 70th year, Herman Shaw was told he did, although he'd never had symptoms. He didn't know how he'd caught it. He may have been born with it. His mother died when he was just 3. Congress investigated, and victims were paid around $10,000 each in compensation. But it took another quarter of a century for an American president to say he was sorry.
What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye
and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful.
Indeed, it was, yet survivors like Herman Shaw showed remarkable grace.
I wish to thank Mr. President Clinton. Thank you very much for inviting us to the White House. It has been over 65 years since we entered the program. We are delighted today to close this very tragic and painful chapter in our lives.
Shaw died 2 years later, buried in the county he'd been born in 97 years earlier. But the chapter had not really closed. As Vice President Al Gore noted, the Tuskegee experiment had far-reaching consequences for many African Americans. In particular, it destroyed their trust in medical science and the government itself.
It was a disgraceful episode for American science. We feel the repercussions still, tremors of distrust that have not yet disappeared. To this day, the Tuskegee study makes some Americans think twice about donating blood or taking their children for vaccinations or signing an organ donor card.
Informed consent is now required for any medical trial, test or procedure in the United States, including the COVID vaccine. But for some, that is still not reassurance enough.
Now, we shouldn't get too carried away with black vaccine hesitancy rates because the numbers can be quite messy. For instance, Hispanics contract more COVID cases than black people, more hospitalisations than black people, and more COVID deaths than black people, and basically have the same percentage between Hispanics and blacks of being unwilling to take the vaccine, at least according to Kaiser. Having said that, this is where your stats came from before, John. More black people would like to wait and see what happens before they take it. That could well be noteworthy. Also, there is no doubt that Tuskegee has left a mark. One study found that life expectancy for black men aged 45 fell by up to 1.5 years because of medical distrust caused by Tuskegee. And that accounted for 35% of the 1980 life expectancy gap between black and white men. That is a wild stat. But now, when New Mexico became America's 17th state to legalise recreational marijuana, it joined New Jersey, New York and Virginia, all of which fully legalised marijuana in the last month or so, adding up to about 43% of the population now living in a state where marijuana is fully legal. And that is increasing fast. Of the last 15 states where marijuana legalisation was put on the ballot, it was approved in 13 of them, including Alaska, Montana and South Dakota. Gallup now registers 68% of Americans supporting the legalisation of marijuana, including about 60% of Republicans. According to Pew, only 8% of Americans say marijuana should not be legal at all. Even Chuck Schumer has vowed to push legalisation in the Senate to not only end the federal ban on marijuana, but to expunge the criminal records of those charged with possession. There's an air of inevitability about all of this, except for Joe Biden.
The president supports leaving decisions regarding legalization for recreational use up to the states, rescheduling cannabis as a Schedule II drug so researchers can study its positive and negative impacts. And at the federal level, he supports decriminalizing marijuana use and automatically expunging any prior criminal records. He also supports legalizing medicinal marijuana.
He will decriminalise, but he will not legalise if he gets his way. But President Biden is not the only one who holds reservations about full legalisation.
No, indeed not, Chaz. Joining us is Kevin Sabet. He's a former White House drug policy advisor to Bill Clinton, George W. Bush and Barack Obama. These days, he's president of the organisation Smart Approaches to Marijuana and author of the book Smokescreen. Kevin, welcome to Planet America.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It does seem right now that you're very much swimming against the tide. Why are you against the full legalisation of marijuana?
Well, you know, when I left the Obama administration about 10 years ago, I didn't think I'd be doing this right now. But when I looked at the science and the data and what every major medical association, really globally, was saying about the harms of cannabis, I realized that most people don't really understand what we're dealing with today's high potency marijuana. And so I think it's important to raise awareness about the danger, the potential danger, and about the fact that legalization really is going to enrich folks like the tobacco industry and really hurt us from a public health perspective.
Of course, Kevin, one of the big arguments in favour of full legalisation is that with legalisation, you get regulation. You can control how strong it is and people know what they're getting. What do you say to that?
Drug dealers love legalization because it normalizes their activity. They can fly under the radar, and they're making a ton of money because they don't have to put a tax on the product, and they can still sell it to whomever they want, normally without any problems. So this is something, legalization sort of doubles your problem. You still have a black market problem, but now you have a problem with legitimate actors using, capitalism and business for ill, trying to get as many people addicted, commercializing it, advertising it, edibles and these cookies and gummy bears. These products wouldn't be around if it wasn't legal.
But surely the black market would thrive more in a state without legalisation than in a state with legalisation.
Well, I'm not sure, because actually some of the biggest Mexican drug cartels make their money from legal activities like mining and logging, even though they're technically drug cartels because they also deal with drugs. So, it's very easy for non-state actors to infiltrate legal markets and thrive in that environment. Also, you could imagine something where, right now we have about 9% of Americans who use marijuana semi-regularly, or in the last, month or so. You could imagine most of them are getting marijuana from the black market. But if you tripled that number to 30%, you can imagine, if it's half black market and half legal market, you still have a lot more people getting it from the black market because you've increased the demand. When you legalize something, you increase the demand for both markets, for both the legal and illegal market. And I'm not saying we should criminalize people. I think we need to be very clear. I'm not trying to put people in prison, give them a criminal record, have a sort of moralistic crusade against war on drugs. That's not what I'm talking about here. Decriminalization would remove criminal penalties, not put people in prison. We can couple that with education, treatment, prevention. It doesn't have to be a stepping stone to legalization. That's very different than a legal commercial sort of normalized market. So I think it's important to understand those nuances.
But surely, Kevin, the ship has sailed. Once upon a time, marijuana was really just the purview of hippie culture and jazz musicians. But now, Nana and Pop Pop are having edibles instead of a martini at the end of the day.
Yes and no. There's no doubt there's been a cultural shift. I'm not denying that. But we have 2 countries, count them, 2, in the entire world that have federally legalized marijuana. We have 16 U.S. states that have technically legalized marijuana. That's 16 out of 50. So, and from a population perspective, Canada and Uruguay weren't exactly the top most populous countries in the world. So, I'm not sure if it's sort of overtaken us. I do think there is a wide misperception about the harms of marijuana. People think of what I call old marijuana, the marijuana they saw in college, the joint that was passed around. They don't think of new marijuana, 99% potency, waxes, dabs, shatter. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you don't know about today's marijuana market. And that's very concerning because most people think they know about the market and they really don't. And it's causing psychosis, schizophrenia, IQ loss, cardiovascular issues. And this isn't just anecdote or hysteria. This is stuff being published by National Academy of Medicine, World Health Organization, National Institutes of Health. All of them are saying, let's slow down, let's learn more. What we know now is not looking good. Let's not rush into this like a lot of places are.
Okay, let's say you're advising a state that has chosen to take the step towards legalisation. Is there a regulation or a set of regulations that you could think of that might minimise the harms of legal marijuana?
Yeah, and actually we're doing that right now, so it's not hypothetical. So I would say we would need to cap the potency of marijuana. There is no need why we need to sell 99% potent marijuana or 50% potent. These are levels that are so outlandish. It's almost a different drug. And so I would put a cap on potency for both the smoked material, the flower, and also the concentrates. So I would do that. I would ban, and I'm advising banning cartoon characters and kid-friendly products. I would ban advertising, although it's a lot easier to do that in Australia than in the United States, unfortunately. Banning advertising is very, very difficult in the US, but I would say that we should try it. I would hold manufacturers responsible for liability, and actually they will be held responsible for liability. I have no doubt there's going to be a day of reckoning legally against these manufacturers. That's just, it's a matter of time once they get bigger and more people have problems with it. But I would look at liability. I would tackle the driving issue. Impaired driving is a huge issue. Marijuana is the number 2 drug after alcohol for impaired driving. I would tackle it much better than we are now. It's a very difficult issue actually to deal with, but I would work with scientists, and I'm advising them to do that now. So there's a lot of change we could do to make this work better.
Kevin, why do you think it is that many legalisation opponents, like say John Hickenlooper, soften their position after their states go through with it?
Well, I know John, and I know a lot of these people that have done this, and I'm sort of smiling because it just goes back to politics. Look, I served in 3 White House administrations. I get it. Politics are a huge part of what we do, and unfortunately have, I think, an undue influence on American policy making. But I think what has happened is, they have some young staffers saying this isn't being reversed anytime soon. It's popular. You got to go for it. They start getting donations. And frankly, another reason is they don't really care either way. Frankly, this is such a low profile issue for most mainstream politicians that they're kind of, eager and fine to agree with their 23-year-old staffer who came in and said, this is great, you should do this, the young people will love you. So I don't think it's out of principle. I don't think it's out of new data. As much as I like these people, and I like John a lot, I think this is really out of kind of, indifference, political expediency, and other factors like that.
Kevin Sabet, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes, it's time once again for a fireside chat, and with this week marking 100 days since Joe Biden was sworn in as America's 46th president, what a good opportunity to take a look at what he has and has not achieved, and to see how the first few months of his presidency might compare to others who have sat behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office. And Chaz, I'm brought to mind of a couple of things that recent guests have said. Earlier in the show, Elaine Kmark agreed with the proposition that Joe Biden, for all his many decades of being a moderate, centrist Democrat, not a kind of a red rag liberal, that he is actually becoming a very significant progressive president in terms of what he's achieved legislatively and what it says about the role of government. And last week, Jesse Jackson said to us, in fact, Joe Biden, he thinks, has turned out to be a terrific president who's been able to get more done precisely because he was not seen as being potentially a socialist like Barack Obama. And for racial reasons and for just the sheer force of his kind of mundane, non-threatening familiarity, he's getting to do stuff that not even Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren could have done. What do you think of that proposition?
Well, it's interesting because current polling, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I've seen a poll recently which suggested that Biden is still seen as a moderate. Basically 50-50, people say moderate versus liberal. Whereas Barack Obama, back in 2009, was seen as a raging liberal, overwhelmingly liberal.
And yet, and Obama was saying at the time, I'm an Eisenhower Republican.
Yes.
Not even Obama considered himself to be left-wing, and he didn't govern that way either.
No, and Biden has been much more left-wing than Obama was by a mile. But I think that just simply reflects the Democrats. I think Biden has this sixth sense for being right in the middle of the Democratic Party at all times. And he's just moved with them. And they have moved so far left of where they were in 2009 that the median vote is much further. So he's done more because he can do more. I'm sure Barack Obama would have loved to have done some of the things that Joe Biden has done, but the Senate wouldn't let him, even with 60 votes.
I mean, this is all for the future and it's speculation, but I'm fascinated to see how Joe Biden's second and third 100 days go, because he's had this flurry of action. The narrative has been things are back to normal, things are getting done, vaccines in arms, paychecks in people's pockets. Everything is going incredibly well. I'm tempted to think that at some point it could all go horribly wrong for Joe Biden still. The gaffe-prone Joe Biden, the old man, the duffer, what's he doing there kind of a thing. It's almost as though maybe it's going to be when the crisis ends, we'll have the luxury of focusing on gaffes. But until the war is over, as it were, people are still generally supportive of the Commander-in-Chief. Do you think that there could be an extended honeymoon that comes to a shuddering end, or is this just what a Joe Biden presidency is going to be like, surprisingly successful?
I think this all comes down to Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. Let's not forget Kyrsten Sinema. Everyone's talking about Joe Manchin all the time. I think, actually, I suspect Kyrsten Sinema might be the issue down the track. I don't know how many more bills they can squeeze out of these people. Elaine Kmark said she's confident that they keep on being able to pass bills. I'm not sure that's the case. They might be able to get a watered-down infrastructure bill out. I'm not sure how much more there's left out of the moderates and the Democratic Party. And if the bills stop, then it comes to a halt. It's completely dependent on the Senate, as far as I can see. The one thing which I would say about Joe Biden, which I think he's really delivered in terms of what he promised, both explicitly and implicitly, is his attempt to stay out of people's attention span.
Yep.
Like he explicitly promised that during the election campaign, I'll get out of your hair. But also that I think people were just kind of just hoping he would. And he really has. Like he hasn't waded into culture wars at all. Not like they've stopped, they keep on going without him. And he says what he needs to do and that's it. Yeah. And he just disappears. And I think that's a bigger deal than people act, because I feel like America is really on a runaway track at the moment to just division. And he's not going to unify anyone, sure, but I think his staying out of it helps a lot, it not get worse.
Yeah, there's no doubt there's a sense of he is the man for the moment. The only question in my mind is how long does the moment last? But let's have a look at how the polls are looking right now, because Joe Biden's approval rating over that first 100 days has been surprisingly steady, hovering in the low to mid 50s, although his disapproval has been ticking up in recent weeks from a low of 34% to its current level, which is the high water mark for disapproval at 41% now. Signs perhaps that honeymoon could be coming to a close. Joe Biden's approval has been consistently 10 points or more higher than Donald Trump's was in the early points of his administration, but below every other single president since Gerald Ford's approval fell off a cliff, basically, at the point that he pardoned Richard Nixon over Watergate. And that probably says, I guess, more about sort of partisanship than performance right now, because Joe Biden's getting early runs on the board.
Yeah, I think it's no coincidence that his approval of 54-42 is the inverse of Trump's 42-54, which Trump was on for almost his entire presidency. I think that's where the battle lines are drawn in America. There's about 54% left, 42% right.
Yeah. Now, you got some more polls for us.
Yes, I do. Issue polls. After 100 days talking here, Biden's looking at 69% approval for how he's handling COVID, 52% approval for how he's handling the economy. That's an interesting one. Then you got some middling results before we see some rather dismal views of his handling of the guns issue and immigration. Do issue polls matter at this point?
Well, I think to your earlier point of when the legislative production line grinds to a halt after perhaps a second or third reconciliation bill, if the moderate senators allow that, that's when those intractable issues start to become more problematic. Because if Biden starts to look impotent, then maybe the midterms are not so good. Maybe there's talk of him being a one-term president. All of a sudden, he's a lame duck quite quickly. So the momentum has to keep going. And yeah, Elaine Kmark made the point about the kind of the heat that's expected to come out of the US economy in the second half of this year. Biden could potentially surf that wave for a year or two, and it could give him the extra impetus to get more done in a legislative sense, because Sinema and Manchin are Democrats and they will generally support some, if not all, of Biden's legislative agenda. But we'll wait and see.
Yeah. All I'd say is I found interesting the 52% approval for his economic handling. I would have thought he would have been hoping to have a higher rating at this point in time. Things are going okay. They're probably going to get better though, so that number will probably go up. Moving off polling though, the Washington Post fact checker Glenn Kessler has tallied up 67 false statements from Biden over his 100 days, compared to 511 false statements during Trump's first 100 days. Now, to be fair, Trump has said 40% more words than Biden. He's tweeted a whole lot more, and personally as well. And Kessler, he may have missed a few from Biden, let's face it. But on the other hand, Trump picked up the pace a little bit during his first term. And by November 2, the day before the 2020 election, Trump registered 504 false statements in one day. Almost as many as in his entire first 100 days. Whoa.
Yeah. I mean, look, as a erstwhile fact checker myself, I look at those numbers and I think, well, what does that tell us? Either lying doesn't matter or fact-checking doesn't matter. But that whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, there's no accountability for making false or misleading claims, or indeed that the metric is problematic, because these are false or misleading claims, and most things that most politicians say most of the time can be characterised as misleading by their rival. It's just, it comes down to degrees, and that's where Pinocchios and things fall a little bit short. But look, we're just about out of time. Before we go, it is time for some absolute malarkey.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
And there was a fascinating insight this week into the Trumpy right-wing echo chamber, with the Daily Mail first claiming Joe Biden's plan to cut carbon emissions by half by 2030 could mean Americans having to drastically reduce their red meat consumption to 1 burger a month. Quelle horreur! Well, Fox News was beside itself with graphics like this. Up in your grill! Biden's climate requirements cut 90% of meat from diet, max 4 pounds per year, 1 burger per month. Don Trump Jr. then tweeted, I'm pretty sure I ate 4 pounds of red meat yesterday. That's going to be a hard no from me. Speaking of hard things, Don Jr.'s colon wasn't available for comment. Meanwhile, Governor Greg Abbott tweeted, not going to happen in Texas. And it was red meat as well for Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, who tweeted, Joe Biden's climate plan includes cutting 90% of red meat from our diets by 2030. They want to limit us to around 4 pounds a year. Why doesn't Joe stay out of my kitchen? And, of course, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene could not resist. She called Joe Biden the Hamburglar and implied that he was a hypocrite for eating a burger himself, although that looks a little bit like chicken. Still, former Trump economic advisor Larry Kudlow, who's now back with a show on Fox Business, weighed in on this too.
No burgers on July 4th. No steaks on the Barbie. I'm sure Middle America is just going to love that. Can you grill those Brussels sprouts?
The source of this burger ban claim, though, wasn't the Biden policy. It was a 2020 University of Michigan study looking at scenarios for cutting food-related emissions in particular. But as one of the authors of that study pointed out, quote, it had nothing to do with Biden or his climate change plan, unquote. Now, to their credit, Fox News did issue a brief correction.
The data was accurate, but a graphic and a script incorrectly implied that it was part of Biden's plan for dealing with climate change. That is not the case.
And John Roberts, it wasn't just, of course, the graphic. It was Fox and Friends. It was The Five. It was Hannity. It was Tucker Carlson. But anyway, as the old saying goes, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. A quote often attributed to Winston Churchill, by the way, although it may have actually been said by Mark Twain or more probably Jonathan Swift. So I suppose that's ironic too, Chaz.
If only quote attributions were our biggest problem at the moment. Here's another worry for you here, John. A New York Post front page tried very hard to create some lame wordplay about a story in which unaccompanied migrant kids were apparently housed in a Long Beach shelter where they were given copies of Kamala Harris's 2019 children's book, Superheroes Are Everywhere, in their welcome kits. Now that made no sense to me. Why would you give an English book to kids who don't speak English? Why are they giving out welcome kits? So many questions. But it made sense to Fox News. They doubled down on the claim that Harris's book is included in welcome packs for migrant children. Photographs apparently show that. Like this photo here, which incidentally seemed to be the same photo that the New York Post ran. One photo. But whatever, conservative media lapped it up all over Fox News just like the other story, and before you know it, this story had made it all the way to the Daily Briefing.
There was a report in the last couple of days in the New York Post that every migrant child being brought to a shelter is being given a copy of her children's book, Superheroes Are Everywhere. Do you know why that is and if she's making any money off of that?
I'd have to certainly check on that. Here, it's a good book.
Except it turns out there was a reason that there was only one photo out there. You see, Long Beach had a book and toy drive to support migrant children, and Kamala's book was one of hundreds donated. It was apparently not purchased by the health department or the city. All this hype was just based on one random photo. And personally, I find it quite easy to believe that someone gave away Kamala Harris's children's book. Look, here's the book drive right there, lots of pics, and according to a Long Beach spokesperson, there's still only one copy of Harris's book that's been donated. Oh, and none of the books are part of any welcome kit, whatever that is. So if all that didn't smell malarkey-ish enough for you, after the Washington Post fact-checked that article, the New York Post disappeared it without a trace. No correction, no retraction, just silence. Until they got called out for that, and then they restored the original article with some changes and an editor's note. And as for the writer of that article, Laura Italiano, she resigned, saying, an incorrect story I was ordered to write and which I failed to push back hard enough against was my breaking point. Thank God she left. You can't have shame in this media environment,
We
John.
don't have it.
It's a mortal sin. Never back down. But what do you think of that apology? Because to me, it almost implies that New York Post knew that was a bullshit story when they ran it.
Yeah, it does imply that. It also implies that she's been pressured to write stories she knew to be incorrect in the past. So ultimately, maybe she should not have been the one to resign. It was the person that forced her to write that story and others.
Exactly.
That's it for another trip to Planet America on ABC News and News Radio. We will be back at the same time next week or whenever you like on ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube.
And we have another pet podcast later on tonight, plus extra stuff on the Planet America Facebook page. See you there.
Bye-bye.